This story is called Ti-Fleur and the Magic Fiddler. Now this story takes place in Quebec, in a time in Quebec when it was very dangerous to live here, because everyone knew that the devil himself walked the roads of Quebec looking for souls to steal. And of all the souls he could get his hands on, the one that he prized the most were the souls of the people of Saint Agat. Because in Saint Agat, they were the most pious people in all of Quebec. Oh, the priest there, he was a busy man and he was a happy man. And so, in Saint Agat, there was a little girl named Ti-Fleur. And she was a rambunctious little 14-year-old girl, moi. If there was a party going on in Saint Agat, you could be sure that Ti-Fleur was there celebrating. And if there was a game going on in town, you could be sure that Ti-Fleur was there winning it. And if there was a fight going on in town, you could be sure that Ti-Fleur was there ending it. Now, Ti-Fleur loved living in Saint Agat because they celebrated all the holidays with so much enthusiasm. She loved Christmas, and she loved Easter, and she loved Thanksgiving. But of all the holidays they celebrated in Saint Agat, the one that she loved the most was the celebration of Mardi Gras, Fat Tuesday, the day before Ash Wednesday, before the beginning of Lent. Now in Quebec, when people celebrate Mardi Gras, it is tradition to have a huge meal. Everyone comes together, they eat their fill, and then when that's done, then they put the tables away and they bring out the fiddler and he starts to play, and the people dance and they celebrate. But all of this has to stop at midnight, because if you're caught celebrating after midnight, well, then the devil could take your soul. So it was that one year the people of Saint Agat were getting ready to celebrate Mardi Gras as they had every other year. But the night before Mardi Gras, old Henri Bourboin, the local town fiddler, he passed away. And without a fiddler, well, they couldn't have any music. And of course, all the other musicians had gigs that night to celebrate Mardi Gras. And the people of Saint Agat decided, well, if there's no fiddler, there's no music. If there's no music, there's no dancing. And if there's no dancing, well, there's no point in having a huge celebration. So everyone in Saint Agat decided that they were going to have a quiet Mardi Gras celebration in their own homes. Everyone except for Ti-Fleur, because Ti-Fleur, she loved the celebration of Mardi Gras. She loved the music, she loved the dancing, she loved the food. And if all they needed was a musician, well, then she was going to find one. And so when the teacher wasn't looking, she crawled out of a window of the schoolhouse and she went down to the crossroads. Now, the crossroads was a place between the towns where people came and they exchanged bits of news. They did a little bit of bartering. There was lots of gossiping going on. All sorts of things were happening. And Ti-Fleur went down to the crossroads and she hid herself in the bushes. And she waited and she watched. And all of a sudden she noticed a young man walking down. Well, hang on. I missed it. But she was listening, and she listened and she heard two young women who were speaking. And one of them said, "Did you hear? There's a young musician looking for a place to play for Mardi Gras celebrations." "Really?" said the second girl. "Is he talented?" "Is he talented?" said the first girl. "Well, I've never heard him play, but they say that when he puts bow to fiddle, it's the most beautiful music that you've ever heard. He wears a colorful scarf around his waist, and the music is so enchanting that the scarf seems to dance to the music as if it had a mind of its own." Well, that's all Ti-Fleur needed to hear. And she watched up and down that road looking for that young man. And of course, she saw him walking towards her with a fiddle underneath his arm and a colorful sash tied around his waist. Well, as soon as he walked near where she was hiding, she stepped out onto the road and she stopped him right there. And she said, "I am Ti-Fleur of Saint Agat, and I have come to invite you to play your fiddle for our Mardi Gras celebrations." Now, the fiddler was surprised to be addressed by such a young girl, but he cocked his head to the side and he said, "I would be honored to play for a place as famous and as pious as Saint Agat." And so Ti-Fleur took him by the scarf and she led him back to the town. Now, Ti-Fleur expected a hero's welcome there. They were going to have a boring Mardi Gras celebration, and now, thanks to her, they had a musician. Because they had a musician, they could have music, they could have dancing, and celebrate this holiday properly. But instead, she got in trouble from her parents for having left the school without permission. Of course, she got in trouble with the the elders for leaving the school without permission. And instead of being able to celebrate, she was shut in the priest's house with all the other children, while the adults, of course, who welcomed the fiddle player, they were making preparations for that night. Ti-Fleur was beside herself with rage. All that hard work, and now she was going to miss the party anyways. So when the priest wasn't looking, nobody locked their windows in this town. She crawled out of a window of the priest's house, and she went down to the church hall. And she went around the back, she looked into the kitchen, and she could see the people making the food. There was tourtière, and there was pudding chômeur, and they even had lamb stew. Coincidentally, they have lamb stew here tonight. And they had all this beautiful food, and her mouth was watering. And then she went over to the side of the church hall, and she looked in through the windows, and she could see everyone was getting the place ready, putting up streamers and balloons and laying out the tables and putting the tablecloths on. And that's when she heard an odd sound. It was a blinking sound. And she looked over, and she could see the fiddler sitting there on the fence, plucking at the strings. And he plucked at the first string, blink, blink, plunk, it broke. Don't break your string. Don't break your string. It plunk, it broke. She pulled the old string from the fiddle, dropped it on the ground. She pulled a new string from her pocket and restrung the fiddle. He plucked at the second string, plink, plink, plunk. It broke. He pulled the old string from the fiddle, dropped it on the ground, pulled a new string from his pocket and restrung the fiddle. He plucked at the fourth string, plink, plink. He plucked at the third string, plink, plink, plunk. It broke. He pulled the old string from the fiddle, dropped it on the ground, pulled a new string from his pocket, and he restrung the fiddle. Now, Ti-Fleur was just about to go over and speak to him when suddenly he stood up, put the fiddle underneath his arm, and he walked into the church hall. And as Ti-Fleur watched him go, she could hear her name being called. Ti-Fleur, Ti-Fleur. She looked around, she thought maybe one of the adults had seen her, so she dove into a bush, but there was no one in sight. Still, she could hear her name being called. Ti-Fleur, Ti-Fleur. She looked down and she realized that the voices were coming from the strings that were on the ground. And she picked them up, and they were strangely warm to the touch, and they glowed with their own light. "Who are you?" she said. "Ti-Fleur," said the strings, "we are lost souls, for that is no ordinary fiddle player, but the devil himself. Tonight, when he plays his fiddle for your town, he will cast a spell upon the people, and he will make them dance, dance, dance past midnight, and then he will take their souls." And Ti-Fleur was terrified. The devil was in their town, and she was the one that brought him there. "What can I do?" she said. Then the strings spoke and said, "Tonight, when he plays his fiddle, you must take us and you must throw us underneath his feet, and that will break the spell upon the town." And Ti-Fleur wept. Now that night, they had a grand old feast. There was all the newest of food and the oldest of drink. They brought out all the best food. People ate to their fill, and when they were done, they pushed away from the tables. I know it looks like I just came from there, doesn't it? And when they were done, they took all the tables and stacked them up in the corner, threw a tablecloth over them, and they brought out a chair. And the fiddler sat down in it, and he put bow to fiddle, and he began to play. The slow, sorrowful song. And it hushed the crowd. And the men and the women, when they heard that fiddle playing, they were moved to tears. And then the tempo changed. And jigs and reels started pouring out of that fiddle. And as soon as the people heard the music, they couldn't help themselves. They jumped up and they began to dance. And they whirled around that room. There were men with women and women with men, men with men and women with women, and they began to dance like mad around that church hall. And Ti-Fleur, who was hidden in the corner underneath all of those tables, she could feel the floor vibrating beneath her feet as they danced. And even though she was protected by the magic of the strings, she had to admit it was the most beautiful music that she had ever heard. The people danced in a mad fury, and hours passed. Till finally Ti-Fleur, hidden under those tables, suddenly, she noticed the floor stopped vibrating. She looked out from underneath the tablecloth, and there she could see the people were still dancing, whirling around in a mad fury around that church hall. And there in the corner she could see the fiddle player, and he was playing his fiddle, and his scarf was weaving and dancing as if it had a mind of its own. But the people started to rise higher and higher in the air, and they danced on nothing. And Ti-Fleur knew that it must almost be midnight. So she gathered up her courage. She took the strings, and she ran out straight for the fiddle player, and his eyes were red, and they seemed to be on fire, and black smoke began to pour out of the fiddle. She took the strings, she threw them beneath his feet, and he screamed as if he had stepped on knives, and everyone who was dancing in the air, they fell to the ground. And they looked up and they saw Ti-Fleur standing there, and they knew how close they had come to losing their souls to the devil that very night. And everyone turned and they looked at the fiddle player, and he was still playing that fiddle. But now it was his turn, and he started to rise higher and higher in the air, and his scarf was weaving and dancing in tune to the music as if it had a mind of its own. And he rose higher and higher in that room, and when he looked like he was about to hit his head on the ceiling, he passed right through it as if he were a ghost. The people came out of the church hall and they watched as the devil, playing his fiddle, rose higher and higher in the air, and just before he was lost from sight, he cocked his head to the side, and he laughed, and he disappeared. Now, if you ever go to Saint Agat, right around the time of Mardi Gras, look up in the night sky, and if you're lucky, maybe you will see the devil's scarf weaving and dancing in the sky. Of course, we call those things the Northern Lights, but now you know what they really are. And if you listen very carefully, you will hear the devil playing his fiddle, and you will have to admit, it's the most beautiful music that you have ever heard. Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah.